My name is Jemma Deer and I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the Harvard University Centre for the Environment. I'm currently working on a book project on extinction called Traces of Humanity, Extinctions in the Anthropocene. The following talk is on J.G. Ballard's novel The Drowned World and the October 2018 IPCC report. I hope you enjoy it. Quick, it is a matter of life and speed. The extinction crisis is not a crisis of extinction as such, for extinction is a necessary part of the process of evolution. The crisis is instead a matter of quickness, of things moving too fast or too slow. The crisis, that is to say, is not that species are going extinct, but rather that rates of extinction are far outpacing those of speciation. The speed of genetic adaptation cannot keep up with the speed at which conditions are changing. In what follows, I will match the urgency of the extinction crisis with 4 fast fires, 4 burning concerns about the fatal accelerations of the Anthropocene and the extinction of thought that might be the cause or the consequence of this experience of speed. Soon it would be too hot. Out of the teeming ground of the opening sentence of J.G. Ballard's 1962 novel The Drowned World, a dense grove of questions emerge. How soon is soon? What timescale should we read this line on? Would it be too hot in a matter of hours, weeks, years, or centuries? And what should we make of the strange folded temporality of the combination of soon and would? Surely it should read, soon it will be too hot. Or has the imagined future of the soon somehow already happened? What will soon be too hot? The day, the season, the planet? What will it be too hot for? Too hot to think? Too hot to bear? Or too hot to live? And how hot, exactly, is too hot? This last question is one that the IPCC grappled with in the 630 pages of its special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees. The report is scattered with parentheses, low confidence, medium confidence, high confidence, as science leaves its solid base of observation for the perilous marshland of future predictions. If you pick your way over this treacherous ground, carefully edging around all these caveats, on page 281, you will find a wormhole that opens out in the year 2100. The following scene unfolds. The world as it was in 2020 is no longer recognizable. With decreasing life expectancy, reduced outdoor labor productivity, and lower quality of life in many regions because of too frequent heat waves and other climate extremes. Droughts and stress on water resources renders agriculture economically unviable in some regions, and poverty rates reach new highs. Major conflicts take place. Almost all ecosystems experience irreversible impacts, species extinction rates are high in all regions, forest fires escalate, and biodiversity strongly decreases. Life, for many indigenous and rural groups, becomes untenable in their ancestral lands. The retreat of the West Antarctic ice sheet accelerates, leading to more rapid sea level rise. Several small island states give up hope of survival in their locations and look to an increasingly fragmented global community for refuge. In a section that gives us storylines of possible worlds resulting from different mitigation options, this is one of the worst-case scenarios. It is a scenario in which we reach 3 degrees of warming by 2100. It describes a future in which, despite past pledges, the international support for the Paris Agreement starts to wane. Carbon dioxide emissions are reduced at the local and national level, but efforts are limited and not always successful. As a worst-case scenario, we would expect it to be bleak, but what is perhaps most disturbing here is not the promised monstrosity of a world no longer recognizable, but rather the realization that much of what is being described, heat waves, droughts, biodiversity loss, fires, has already begun to occur. Given that the IPCC's work is rendered somewhat tokenistic by governments that continue to subsidise and support fossil fuels, arriving at the world described by this worst-case scenario would be devastating, but it would hardly come as a surprise. As Jeremy Davies writes, at present the world's total indicated fossil fuel reserves hold another 780 billion tonnes of carbon, and the global economy rests on the curious supposition that all of it will shortly be extracted and burned. The future, in economic terms, is already burning. Those that would accuse me of catastrophizing by choosing to quote the worst-case scenario can rest uneasy in the knowledge that even the mid-case scenario holds little comfort. Here, the international community continues to largely support the Paris Agreement, but only agree on targets that are not ambitious enough to reach stabilisation at 2 degrees of warming, let alone 1.5 degrees. And how much, I wonder, rests on the outright disaster announced by that word largely? Could we interpret this as a subtle allusion to a dissenting president who has been known to use the word bigly? Anyway, this projected failure of ambition would result in, the report says, deadly heat waves, droughts, major flooding, increasing levels of public unrest and political destabilisation, elimination of coral reefs, steadily rising sea levels, intensifying storms, elevated rates of food insecurity, hunger and poverty, prolonged famines, greatly increased extinction rates, and considerable increase in levels of poverty and disadvantage. Any one of these mid-case outcomes would be cause for major alarm, but of course the radical interconnection of climate change brings the threat of the whole assemblage. Soon it would be too hot. The world as it was in 2020 is no longer recognisable. There is something in the folded temporalities of these two phrases that captures the proleptic nostalgia of the Anthropocene, in which we find ourselves looking back on the future as if it were already the past, as if turning our gaze like this might work to reverse the course of history. One of the keywords of climate studies is irreversibility, underlining the notion that the transformations are permanent, that they cannot be undone. For the most part, however, talk of irreversibility is couched within a particular scale, that of the Holocene and the near future of human civilization. Sea level, atmospheric carbon dioxide and temperature can all increase and decrease given the appropriate conditions and timescales. All of these things are, in fact, entirely reversible, given enough time. When a species goes extinct, however, the notion of irreversibility holds true at any scale. While total biodiversity might increase and decrease over time, no future biodiversity could be qualitatively the same as it has been in the past. Extinction, like burning, only goes one way. As such, the thought of extinction perhaps holds the most force for conveying the critical urgency of the Anthropocene. Even if the planet can return to a previous climate, there will be no going back to life. The Drowned World, Ballard's haunting and prescient novel with which I opened, takes the kind of long view that troubles notions of climate change as a one-way process. 60 years before the time of the narrative, violent solar storms have set off a process of runaway global warming, which brings about a future that is figured as a recapitulation of the past. As one character says, in response to the rises in temperature, humidity and radiation levels, the flora and fauna of this planet are beginning to assume once again the forms they displayed the last time such conditions were present, roughly speaking, the Triassic. The novel describes a world of continuous heat waves, rising water levels, and encroaching jungle. A world in which a steady decline in mammalian fertility is matched by a growing ascendancy of amphibian and reptile forms. the pre-human state to which the planet is returning brings with it the threat of a post-human state, as the conditions necessary for human societies diminish and disappear. We read that the cities of Europe and North America are either drowned by lagoons or smothered by giant forests. We learn that there are fewer than 5 million people still living on the polar caps, and that, because of the increased solar radiation, the birth of a child had become a comparative rarity. Robert Currans, one of the biologists posted at the lagoons submerging what was once London, conceives of this ever-decreasing human population as a kind of reversal. He imagines that the genealogical tree of mankind is systematically pruning itself, apparently moving backwards in time, and that a point might ultimately be reached where a second Adam and Eve find themselves alone in a new Eden. Ballard's novel comes to us with renewed force today, not only because it is premised on runaway global warming, but also because of the ways in which it presents the thought of extinction as the extinction of thought. If a second Adam and Eve found themselves alone in a new Eden, as Currans imagines, there would also be a passing back from knowledge to non-knowledge, a return to innocence and unashamed nudity, an undoing of the fall. In Genesis, the knowledge attained by eating the forbidden fruit is reflective. It is consciousness as self-consciousness, sight that turns back on itself. And the eyes of them both were opened, and they knew that they were naked, as we read in the Bible. Sight, as is so often the case, is a metaphor for conscious thought. The eye becomes an eye. To reverse this process would be to relinquish sight for blindness, to pass out of thought into its unthinkable other. Ballard's novel imagines the coming or returning of a world in which there are no eyes to see, a world without readers in which any meaning erodes into senselessness. When Currans comes across his former colleague Lieutenant Hardman in the final chapter of the novel, Hardman is nearly blind. The dirt and raw, sun-blistered skin around the deep eye sockets turned them into blackened funnels. Both eyes were almost completely occluded by corneal cancers, and Currans guessed they would be able to see little more than the dying sun. Hardman's literal blindness is matched by a cognitive blindness, as his human capacity for consciousness as self-consciousness seems to have also been extinguished, a fact that becomes apparent through his loss of meaningful language. Currans is first alerted to Hardman's presence by a faint, almost inhuman cry that sounded thinly into the wet air like the groan of a stricken animal. Hardman no longer responds to his own name, nor does he recognize Currans, and when he does speak, what he says issues as, quote, a monologue of orders and instructions, that is, merely automatic reiterations of his former role rather than genuine communication. This reflects the common intuition that human thought is, to a very great extent, reliant on language. Philosopher Daniel Dennett suggests that not only do we need language to have complex thoughts, but that it was also the initial appearance of primitive linguistic structures that enabled human consciousness to evolve. The human mind, the comprehending mind, he writes, is a product of symbiosis, combining genetically evolved primate brains with mimetically evolved language. In this view, human consciousness did not exist prior to language, but rather the first simple forms of displaced or symbolic reference that language enabled was a necessary basis for consciousness to emerge. Our ancestors' newfound ability to refer to things that were out of sight or in the past would have necessitated the evolution of our capacity for imagination. But just as consciousness relies on language, language, if it is to have any meaning, also relies on consciousness. Without a reading or listening mind to animate them, words are just random sounds in the air or shapes on a page. And so to imagine the extinction of the human species is to imagine a world without readers, and therefore a world without meaning. At the very end of The Drowned World, we read that Quran scratches a few words on a wall, but is, quote, sure that no one would ever read the message. The imminent dawn of a post-human planet renders his words as meaningless as Hardman's monologue. In his book Underland, Robert Macfarlane recognises how the thought of human extinction might transform our thinking of the present. He writes that, among the relics of the Anthropocene will be the fallout of our atomic age, the crushed foundations of our cities, the spines of millions of intensively farmed ungulates, and the faint outlines of some of the billions of plastic bottles we produce each year. Philip Larkin famously proposed that what will survive of us is love. Wrong. What will survive of us is plastic, swine bones, and lead-207, the stable isotope at the end of the uranium-235 decay chain. From the perspective of deep time, that is to say, all our poetry and art, all our acts of love and compassion matter less than our material traces. If the thought of extinction reduces our humanity to a set of material remains, is it possible to find a reason for reason beyond our own transient self-imaginings? Is there, that is to say, a broader point or purpose to our capacity to think? There are two ways to approach questions of purpose, from an evolutionary standpoint and from a human one, which, as Daniel Dennett recognises, can be seen as the subtle but significant difference between the questions why and what for. The human perspective asks why. Why are we here? Why can we think? Why are humans the way they are? The fact that many millennia of religious and philosophical traditions have failed to produce a definitive answer is testament to the intractability of these questions. The evolutionary perspective, on the other hand, doesn't ask why, it asks what for. The question then is not why do we think, but what do we think for? What was it about linguistic consciousness that was beneficial enough for it to be reproduced? How did the symbiosis of the primate brain and that living thing we call language make for perhaps the most potent organism in Earth's history so far, Homo sapiens? This question we can answer more easily. It is a matter of speed or quickness. Genetic and mimetic evolution are structurally the same. They are both forms of evolution by natural selection, ways of information being developed through reproduction and modification. For billions of years of Earth's history, organic reproduction was an effective but slow means of transmitting information and refining designs. In language, information can be passed on much more quickly and efficiently, bypassing the huge energy expenditure needed to create a new generation of organisms. This was a great acceleration, the likes of which the planet had not seen. This newfound speed left genetic adaptation in the dust. The quickening of human thought was the beginning of the end for many species of megafauna in the Pleistocene, as well as being the main pressure of the current Anthropocene extinction crisis. So the answer to the what for question is speed. But I want to suggest that an answer to the why question might be that too. I opened this talk by saying that the speed of genetic adaptation cannot keep pace with the speed at which environmental conditions are now changing. At the evolutionary timescale, species have no more time to adapt to newly hostile conditions than human beings in the blast zone of a bomb would have to run away. Is it just by chance that the evolution of a creature quick and clever enough to alter the planet's systems at every level is also the evolution of a creature that can see and know what it is doing and can place these acts into ethical categories? Or could it be that consciousness as self-consciousness evolved as a protective mechanism against the destructive force of blind speed? Either way, human consciousness is now the only process capable of responding to today's planetary transformations at the requisite speed, and the only process, therefore, that is capable of protecting the millions of species of life that are now at risk. If there is a reason to think, or a reason for our thinking, then it is to act quickly.